Hi, I'm Madison. At my sister's medical school graduation party, the one I paid for with my life savings, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong here. Get out." I smiled, handed her the envelope I'd been carrying, and watched her face drain of color as she read the first line. She had no idea I'd been recording her phone calls for months, documenting every lie, every forged signature, every penny she'd stolen from our grandmother's trust fund, while I worked 3 jobs to keep her dream alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flutes caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Riverside Country Club. Everything about the graduation party screamed success. White linens, orchid centerpieces, and servers gliding between tables with silver trays of appetizers that cost more than most people's grocery budgets. It was exactly the kind of celebration Emma had always dreamed of. The kind she'd described in tearful late-night phone calls when the pressure of medical school felt overwhelming. What she didn't know was that I'd been planning this moment for 8 months. I stood near the entrance, watching her work the room like the natural performer she'd always been. Dr. Emma Claire Mitchell, fresh from Northwestern Medical School, radiant in her ivory cocktail dress, accepting congratulations, with the same gracious smile she'd perfected since childhood. Her honey blonde hair was swept into an elegant updo, and she wore the pearl earrings our mother had given her for her white coat ceremony, the ceremony I'd flown to Chicago to attend, taking unpaid time off from my job at the accounting firm. Madison. My Aunt Carol approached with her usual enthusiasm, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and white wine. "You must be so proud, all those years of supporting Emma, and look at her now." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "She's certainly achieved her goal." Carol didn't catch the careful phrasing. She never did. "I remember when you first told us you were helping with her tuition. 22 years old, barely out of college yourself, taking on that kind of responsibility. Your parents would be so proud of both of you." The mention of our parents sent a familiar ache through my chest. They'd died in a car accident when Emma was 17 and I was 22, just weeks before her high school graduation. The life insurance and their modest savings had been split between us equally. But Emma's portion was earmarked for college, in a trust that wouldn't fully vest until she turned 25. Mine came immediately, along with the responsibility of becoming her guardian for the final 8 months before she turned 18. "Emma's always been driven," I replied to Carol, my eyes finding my sister across the room. She was laughing with Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of cardiology at St. Mary's Hospital, where she'd secured her residency. Everything was falling into place for her, just as she'd planned. Just as we'd planned, I'd thought, back when we still meant something. The first crack in my faith in Emma had appeared 3 years earlier, during her second year of medical school. I'd been working as a senior accountant at Morrison & Associates during the day and freelancing as a bookkeeper for small businesses at night, sometimes until 2 in the morning, to cover her living expenses on top of tuition. The workload was crushing, but Emma's grades were stellar, and her letters home were filled with gratitude and updates about her studies. Then I'd gotten the credit card statement. It was addressed to me, but the charges were all Emma's: spa treatments, designer clothes, expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford to visit. When I called her, confused, she'd cried and apologized, explaining that the pressure of school was overwhelming and she'd made some mistakes. She promised it wouldn't happen again, begged me not to cut off her support, insisted that she'd be more careful. I'd forgiven her. Added the debt to my growing pile of financial obligations and taken on a third freelance client to cover the payments. The second crack came a year later when I discovered she'd been telling her friends that our parents had left her a substantial trust fund that covered her expenses. Not technically a lie, but not the whole truth either. She'd conveniently omitted the part about her older sister working herself to exhaustion to bridge the gap between her trust fund disbursements and the actual cost of her education and lifestyle. But it was the third crack, just 8 months ago, that had shattered my illusions completely. I'd been organizing our family documents for tax purposes when I found them. Photocopies of checks from our grandmother's estate, made out to Emma, deposited into an account I'd never known existed. Our grandmother, Helen Patricia Mitchell, had died when we were children, leaving a small trust fund to be split between Emma and me when we each turned 30. The fund was managed by our family attorney, Mr. Richard Donovan, who sent annual statements showing steady, modest growth, except Emma had apparently been receiving early distributions for the past 2 years. The discovery had sent me to Mr. Donovan's office on a cold February morning, my hands shaking as I placed the photocopies on his mahogany desk. He'd gone pale, adjusted his glasses, and reached for a thick file with Emma's name on it. "I was wondering when you'd find out," he'd said quietly. "Emma came to me 18 months ago with what she claimed was your written authorization for early distributions from both trusts. She said you were having financial difficulties and needed the money moved to her account temporarily. My written authorization. Forged, obviously, but skillfully done. Emma had always been good at mimicking handwriting. It was a talent she'd discovered in high school when she'd started signing our permission slips after our parents died. How much?" I'd asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. $73,000. From both accounts combined. The number had hit me like a physical blow. $73,000. Almost exactly the amount I'd been struggling to cover for her final year of medical school, working myself into exhaustion, sacrificing my own future, my own dreams of graduate school, my own life. Mr. Donovan had leaned forward, his expression grave. "Madison, I need you to know that I had concerns about the arrangement from the beginning. The signatures looked correct, but Emma's demeanor, she seemed nervous, evasive. I should have contacted you directly to confirm, but she insisted you were too proud to discuss financial difficulties openly. That detail had been particularly cruel in its accuracy. I was proud, had always been the one to solve problems rather than create them, to shoulder responsibility without complaint. Emma had used my own character traits against me, knowing exactly what story would be believable to our longtime family attorney. Sitting in that office, staring at the evidence of my sister's systematic deception, I'd felt something fundamental shift inside me. The protective instinct that had driven me to sacrifice for Emma's dreams, the sisterly love that had motivated years of exhaustion and financial strain, began to calcify into something harder and more focused. But I hadn't confronted her immediately. Instead, I'd done what I did best. I'd planned. The next day, I'd gone to a private investigator recommended by a colleague at the firm. Jason Torres was a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases, a man with kind eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. I'd hired him to document Emma's activities, her actual living situation, her spending patterns, her associations. What he'd uncovered over the following months had been worse than I'd imagined. Emma wasn't just lying about the money. She was lying about everything. The modest apartment she'd described in her letters was actually a luxury condo in one of Chicago's most expensive neighborhoods, shared with her boyfriend Kyle Brennan, a relationship she'd hidden from me for over a year. The financial stress she'd claimed was actually a carefully constructed fiction designed to justify her constant requests for additional support. Most damaging of all, she'd been telling people in her social circle a completely different version of our family story. In Emma's version, I was the struggling younger sister who'd never quite found her footing after our parents' death, while she was the responsible one who'd managed her inheritance wisely and was generously helping me get back on my feet. The reversal was so complete, so audacious that I'd almost admired it. Now, watching her hold court at her graduation party, I marveled at her performance. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, who'd never questioned whether she deserved the success she was celebrating. "Madison, there you are." Emma's voice cut through my thoughts. As she approached, her smile bright and seemingly genuine. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Come meet Dr. Webb. He's been asking about you." She linked her arm through mine with the easy affection we'd shared as children, before money and deception had complicated everything between us. For just a moment, I felt an echo of the bond we'd once had, the partnership that had gotten us through our parents' death and the uncertain years that followed. Then I remembered the envelope in my purse, and the feeling passed. "Actually, Emma, I was hoping we could talk privately for a few minutes," I said, keeping my voice light. "Maybe step outside to the terrace?" Something flickered in her eyes, wariness, perhaps, or calculation. But her smile never wavered. "Of course. Let me just finish making the rounds. This is such an important night for networking, you know? Dr. Webb was just telling me about a research opportunity that could really set me apart during residency. Another opportunity, another advantage, another step up the ladder she'd been climbing on my back for years." "I understand," I said. "But it's important, Emma. Family business." The phrase hung between us, loaded with implications she couldn't quite decipher but clearly recognized as significant. Her grip on my arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is everything okay?" she asked, and for the first time that evening, her concern sounded genuine. I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the expensive dress, the professional manicure, the confidence that came from never having to doubt whether you could afford your dreams. She was beautiful, successful, poised on the brink of everything she'd always wanted. She was also about to lose it all. "Everything's fine," I lied, with the same smooth delivery she'd perfected over the years of lying to me. "I just have something to give you. A graduation gift." Relief flooded her features. "Oh, Madison, you didn't have to do that. You've already done so much." The irony of the statement would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. "I wanted to," I said. "After all, what are sisters for?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The terrace overlooked the Chicago River, its dark waters reflecting the city lights that were just beginning to twinkle in the early evening dusk. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias from the country club's gardens, mixing with the distant hum of traffic and the muffled sounds of celebration from inside. It was the kind of setting that should have felt peaceful, but tension crackled between Emma and me like electricity before a storm. She'd finally agreed to step outside after another 20 minutes of networking. Her social obligations, apparently, more pressing than her sister's urgent request. Now she stood with her back to the stone railing, arms crossed, her posture defensive despite her continued smile. "So," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, bright and curious on the surface, but with an underlying edge that suggested she was prepared for battle. "What's this mysterious family business that couldn't wait until after my graduation party?" I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. It was thick, substantial, the kind of envelope that held important documents. Life-changing documents. I'd practiced this moment so many times in my apartment, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, working to keep my expression neutral and my voice steady. "I wanted to give you this," I said, extending the envelope toward her. "Your graduation gift." Emma's eyes flicked from my face to the envelope and back again. Something in my tone must have warned her because her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before reasserting itself with renewed brightness. "Madison, you're being so mysterious." She laughed, but she didn't reach for the envelope immediately. "What is it?" "Open it and see." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, Emma took the envelope with hands that were almost steady, her manicured nails clicking against the paper as she worked at the seal. I watched her face carefully. memorizing every micro expression as she pulled out the first document. It was a bank statement. Her bank statement, to be precise, from the account I wasn't supposed to know existed. The account where she'd been, depositing the money stolen from our grandmother's trust fund. The color drained from Emma's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without producing any sound. She looked like a fish gasping for air, all her practiced composure evaporating in an instant. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "Keep reading," I said quietly. "There's more." Her hands were shaking now as she pulled out the next document, a photocopied check made out to Emma Claire Mitchell from the Helen Patricia Mitchell Trust, bearing a signature that looked remarkably like mine but had been written by someone else's hand. Behind that, another check, and another. 7 in total, representing the systematic theft of my inheritance over the course of 2 years. "Madison, I can explain." "Keep reading." The next document was a photograph printed on standard copy paper. It showed Emma and Kyle Brennan at what was clearly an expensive restaurant, raising champagne glasses in a toast. They were both laughing, Emma's head thrown back in delight, wearing a dress that cost more than I made in a week. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken just 3 weeks earlier, on the same day she'd called me crying about how she might have to drop out of medical school because of financial stress. Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid. "You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting myself," I corrected, which is something I should have started doing a long time ago. She flipped through the remaining pages, credit card statements showing charges at luxury stores, receipts for spa treatments and expensive dinners, photos of her condo that revealed a lifestyle completely at odds with the struggling student narrative she'd been feeding me for years. At the very bottom of the stack was a transcript of a recorded phone conversation between Emma and Kyle, discussing how much longer they could keep up the charade before I caught on. "You recorded my private conversations?" Emma's voice rose, genuine outrage cutting through her shock. "That's illegal!" "Actually, it's not. Illinois is a one-party consent state, and Kyle was aware of the recording. He's been working with the private investigator I hired." I watched as this new betrayal hit her, adding another layer of devastation to her already crumbling world. "Turns out your boyfriend has a gambling problem you didn't know about, and he was more than willing to cooperate when my PI offered to help with his debts in exchange for information." Emma staggered backward until she hit the stone railing, her face cycling through emotions so rapidly I could barely track them. Shock, fury, betrayal, and something that might have been genuine fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used so effectively over the years. "The pressure I was under, the expectations—" "Stop!" The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through her words like a blade. "Don't you dare try to manipulate me with that wounded victim act. Not anymore." For a moment, we stood in silence except for the sound of Emma's ragged breathing and the distant music from the party inside. I could see her mind working, searching for an angle, a way to spin this situation back in her favor. It was fascinating to watch, like observing a master craftsperson at work, except the craft was deception. "Look," she said finally, her voice dropping to a more intimate register, the one she'd always used when she needed something from me. "I made some mistakes, okay? I got caught up in the lifestyle, the pressure to fit in with my classmates. You have no idea what it's like to be surrounded by people who've never had to worry about money, who take luxury for granted. I just wanted to feel like I belonged." The explanation was so perfectly crafted, so precisely calibrated to appeal to my protective instincts, that I almost admired it. She was using my own psychology against me, just as she always had, banking on my tendency to prioritize her well-being over my own pain. "How much did you take?" I asked. Emma blinked, clearly thrown by the directness of the question. "What?" "From the trust fund, from the account with my name on it. How much did you steal?" "I didn't steal anything." The protest, was automatic, indignant. It was a loan. I was always planning to pay it back once I started earning money as a doctor. $73,000, I said, watching her flinch at the number. That's how much you forged my signature to access. $73,000 that was supposed to help secure my future, while I worked myself half to death trying to secure yours. Emma's composure was fracturing completely now, tears beginning to well in her eyes. But I'd seen those tears before, used against me too many times to be moved by them now. I was going to tell you, she said desperately. I was waiting for the right time, after graduation, when I could explain everything properly. When? Were you going to tell me about Kyle? The question hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth worked silently for several seconds before she managed to speak. That's different. That's personal. Personal? I let out a laugh that had no humor in it. Emma, you've been lying to me about every aspect of your life for years. You've been stealing from me, manipulating me, using me, and lying to other people about who I am and what our relationship is really like. Nothing about this is personal anymore. It's all business. Something in my tone must have finally penetrated her shock, because her tears stopped and her expression hardened. This was the Emma I'd suspected existed beneath the sweet, grateful sister act. Calculating, ruthless, and completely unrepentant when cornered. So what? She said, her voice cold now. What do you want from me? You want me to grovel? You want me to throw away everything I've worked for because you're jealous that I found a way to make it work? The mask had finally slipped completely. No more tears, no more pleading, no more manipulation. Just naked self-interest and a complete inability to understand that her actions had consequences beyond their impact on her own life. I want you to understand what you've done, I said quietly. Not just to me, but to yourself. Do you think this ends here? Do you think there aren't going to be consequences? Emma straightened, some of her old confidence returning now that she was no longer pretending to be sorry. What consequences? You going to report me to the police? Good luck proving anything. The signatures look legitimate, and it's your word against mine about what I did or didn't promise to pay back. She was partially right, and we both knew it. The forged signatures were skillful enough that proving fraud would be difficult and expensive. A criminal case would be uncertain at best, and even if successful, it would likely result in nothing more than restitution and probation for a first-time offender with no prior record. But Emma had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that criminal prosecution was my only option. You're right, I said, tucking the documents back into the envelope. The police probably aren't interested in a complicated financial dispute between sisters. But you know who is interested? The Northwestern University Office of Student Conduct. Emma went very still. And the Illinois State Medical Board, I continued. They take ethical violations very seriously, especially when they involve fraud and deception. Hard to practice medicine when your license application is flagged for moral turpitude. You wouldn't. But even as she said it, I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I also had an interesting conversation with Dr. Webb this afternoon, I said, watching her face carefully. About the research opportunity he mentioned. Apparently, it's quite competitive, and candidates are selected based not just on academic performance, but on character and integrity. The kind of character assessment that might be affected by, say, a formal complaint filed with the university. Emma's breathing was becoming shallow again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was panic. You can't do this to me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, everything you've sacrificed? The words came out louder than I'd intended, sharp with years of suppressed rage. Emma, I sacrificed everything for you. My savings, my social life, my own dreams of graduate school, my health, my sanity. I worked 3 jobs to support your lies while you lived in luxury and told people I was the family failure. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. And even after all of that, Even after discovering what you'd done, I gave you a chance. I could have filed those complaints months ago. I could have exposed you before your graduation, before your residency was confirmed, before any of this became real. But I didn't. I waited. I gave you the opportunity to come clean, to make things right, to show even a shred of genuine remorse. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and squandered trust. Instead, I continued, you stood in that ballroom 20 minutes ago and told me I didn't belong at your graduation party. The graduation party I paid for. You told me to get out of the celebration of achievements I made possible through my own suffering. Emma's face was pale now, all her earlier defiance evaporating as she began to understand the true scope of what she was facing. Madison, please, she said, her voice cracking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I handled this badly, but we can fix it. I'll pay you back every penny, I swear. I'll make this right. But it was too late for apologies. The damage was done, and more than that, I finally understood who my sister really was beneath all the masks she wore. The sister who had comforted me after our parents' funeral, who had promised we'd always take care of each other, who had sworn that family was the most important thing in the world. That sister had been as much of a fiction as everything else. About Emma's life. The complaints have already been filed, I said quietly. Emma's knees buckled, and she had to grab the railing to keep from falling. But there is one thing you can do, I added, and hope flickered desperately in her eyes. Anything, she whispered. I'll do anything. I smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally learned to play the game by the same rules as their opponent. You can go back inside and tell all your friends and colleagues the truth about who paid for your education. You can explain to Dr. Webb that your research opportunity should probably go to someone whose achievements weren't built on stolen money. And you can announce to everyone at this party that your sister Madison, the one you just told didn't belong here, is actually the person who made all of this possible. Emma stared at me in horror. I can't do that. It would ruin everything. Then I guess you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices, I said, turning to walk back toward the party. Madison, wait! Emma's voice was desperate now, all pretense finally abandoned. Please, you don't understand what this will do to me. I paused at the terrace door and looked back at her one last time. I understand perfectly, I said. The question is, do you? I didn't wait for Emma's response. The terrace door closed behind me with a soft click, muffling her desperate calls as I walked back into the warmth and light of the graduation party. The contrast was jarring. Inside, everything continued exactly as it had before. The same polite laughter, the same clinking of glasses, the same carefully orchestrated celebration of Emma's achievements. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere, at least for me. The air felt thinner, charged with the electricity of impending change. Dr. Harrison Webb approached me almost immediately, his silver hair catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of Chicago's most respected cardiac surgeons. Madison, isn't it? He said warmly. Emma's told me so much about you. I understand you work in finance? Accounting, actually, I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. I'm a senior accountant at Morrison & Associates. Morrison & Associates. Excellent firm. I've worked with them on several hospital board matters. Dr. Webb's expression grew thoughtful. Emma mentioned you've been incredibly supportive during her medical school journey. That kind of family support makes all the difference in a student's success. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression neutral. Emma's very talented. She's worked hard for this achievement. Indeed, she has. In fact, I was just discussing a research opportunity with her. We're launching a new cardiac intervention study, and we're looking for a resident with exceptional analytical skills and uncompromising ethical standards." He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people, quickly and accurately. Character matters tremendously in medical research. One ethical lapse can compromise years of work and put patients at risk. I nearly choked on my champagne. "I'm sure Emma understands the importance of ethical conduct." "I hope so. The medical field has no tolerance for deception or manipulation, especially when it comes to research funding and patient care." Dr. Webb's tone was conversational, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was testing me, probing for information he suspected I might have. Before I could respond, Emma appeared at my side, slightly breathless and with two bright spots of color on her cheeks. Her smile was strained, but she managed to project an air of casual confidence as she slipped her arm through mine in a gesture that might have looked sisterly to observers, but felt more like a restraint. "Dr. Webb, I hope my sister isn't boring you with accounting stories," she said with a laugh that sounded only slightly forced. "Madison's always been the practical one in the family." On the contrary, we were having a fascinating discussion about the importance of ethical standards in professional practice, Dr. Webb replied, his gaze moving between Emma and me with apparent interest. "Madison was just telling me how much she values integrity in her work." I felt Emma's grip on my arm tighten imperceptibly. "Well, that's Madison for you," Emma said, her voice artificially bright. "Always the moral compass of the family. Sometimes I think she's too honest for her own good." The comment was clearly meant as a gentle jab, a way to position me as naive or overly rigid in front of her potential mentor. But Dr. Webb's expression suggested he was reading between the lines, picking up on the subtle tension that Emma was trying so hard to mask. "Honesty is never a weakness in medicine," he said quietly. "If anything, it's the foundation upon which everything else is built. Patients trust us with their lives, and that trust must be earned through consistent ethical behavior." Emma's laugh sounded more brittle now. "Of course, absolutely. I completely agree. I'm glad to hear it." Dr. Webb checked his watch, then looked back at Emma with a professional smile. "Speaking of which, I should mention that the research position I discussed earlier will require a comprehensive background review. Standard procedure for any position involving federal research funding. We'll need to verify academic records, financial history, character references. Quite thorough, actually." The color drained from Emma's face so quickly that I thought she might faint. Her grip on my arm became painful. "Background review?" she managed to ask. "Oh yes, absolutely essential. The NIH has very strict requirements about researchers' ethical standards. Any history of academic dishonesty, financial impropriety, or legal issues would automatically disqualify a candidate." Dr. Webb's tone remained pleasant and conversational, but his eyes were sharp. "I assume that won't be a problem?" Emma opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I watched her struggle, part of me feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for the sister I'd once loved, the girl who had cried in my arms after our parents' funeral and promised we'd always be there for each other. "I'm sure Emma's record is spotless," I said finally, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "She's always been very careful about following rules." Dr. Webb nodded, but something in his expression suggested he'd heard the hesitation in my voice. "Excellent. Well, I should make my rounds. But Emma, please do send me that research proposal we discussed. I'll be very interested to review it." As he walked away, Emma's grip on my arm became almost desperate. "Madison, please," she whispered. "Urgently. You can't let this happen. That research position, it's everything I've worked for. It's my entire future." I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the designer dress and perfect makeup to the panic in her eyes. For just a moment, she looked like the scared 17-year-old who had begged me not to let her be split up from me after our parents died. who had promised she'd make them proud, who had sworn she'd never let me down. But that girl was gone, if she'd ever really existed at all. "You should have thought about your future before you decided to steal from mine," I said quietly. "I was going to pay it back," she hissed. "Every penny, I swear. I just needed time to establish myself, to start earning real money." "With whose money, Emma? The research grant you're applying for? More forged signatures? Another manipulated family member?" I shook my head. "When does it end?" Emma's face cycled through a range of emotions: desperation, anger, calculation. I could practically see her mind working, searching for the right combination of words that would make me relent, that would restore her ability to manipulate me into compliance. "Look," she said, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd always used when she needed something from me. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But destroying my career won't fix anything. It won't get your money back, and it won't make you feel better. It'll just ruin both our lives." The appeal to my protective instincts was skillfully done, I had to admit. Even now, even knowing everything I knew about her, part of me wanted to believe that she was capable of change, that the sister I'd loved still existed somewhere beneath the layers of deception and selfishness. But then I remembered the look on her face when she'd told me I didn't belong at her graduation party, the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed me in front of her friends and colleagues. I remembered the bank statements, the forged signatures, the systematic theft of my future. I remembered the phone recording where she and Kyle had laughed about how easily they could manipulate poor Madison into supporting their lifestyle. "You're right," I said, and hope flickered in her eyes. "Destroying your career won't get my money back?" Emma's shoulders sagged with relief. "But it will prevent you from doing this to someone else," I continued, watching the hope die in her expression. "And it will ensure that patients' lives aren't put at risk by someone who views ethical standards as optional conveniences." "Madison, no." But I was already walking away, moving through the crowd toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Emma, following, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor as she tried to catch up without causing a scene. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice called out over the sound system, and I turned to see Kyle Brennan standing near the small stage at the front of the room, a microphone in his hand and a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." Emma froze beside me, her face going white with terror. "I'd like to say a few words about our beautiful graduate, Dr. Emma Mitchell," Kyle continued, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room. "Emma and I have been together for over a year now, and I've had the privilege of watching her navigate the challenges of medical school with grace, determination, and the unwavering support of her incredible sister, Madison." Every eye in the IA room turned toward me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. This wasn't part of my plan. Kyle was supposed to be providing information to my private investigator, not making public speeches at Emma's graduation party. "Madison," Kyle continued, his gaze finding mine across the crowded room, "has been Emma's rock throughout this entire journey. She's worked multiple jobs, sacrificed her own dreams, and provided both financial and emotional support that made Emma's success possible. She's the kind of sister we all wish we had, and I think she deserves recognition for her role in this achievement." The room erupted in applause, and I found myself the center of attention in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. Emma stood frozen beside me, her mouth slightly open, clearly as stunned by Kyle's speech as I was. But Kyle wasn't finished. "In fact," he said, his smile taking on a sharper edge, "I think it's important that everyone here understands just how much Madison has sacrificed for Emma's education. The financial records I've reviewed show that Madison has contributed over $200,000 to Emma's medical school expenses, including tuition, living expenses, and—" He paused dramatically. "Some rather substantial withdrawals from family trust funds that were supposed to be split equally between the sisters." The room went silent except for the sound of Emma's sharp intake of breath. Madison, Kyle continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly tense atmosphere, I think everyone here would like to know. How does it feel to have financed your sister's education with your own inheritance money, only to be told tonight that you don't belong at her graduation party? The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me, could sense the shift in the room's energy, as people began to process what Kyle had just revealed. Emma stood beside me like a statue, her face cycling through expressions of shock, horror, and desperate calculation. Dr. Webb was staring at Emma with an expression of growing concern and disappointment. Other guests were whispering among themselves, putting together pieces of a puzzle they hadn't realized they were solving. And Kyle stood at the microphone, still smiling, waiting for someone to respond to the bombshell he'd just dropped into the middle of Emma's carefully orchestrated celebration. I realized, with a mixture of admiration and horror, that my private investigator's informant had just delivered a more devastating blow to Emma's reputation than any formal complaint I could have filed. The question now was what I was going to do about it. Emma turned to me, her eyes pleading, her composure finally cracking completely. Madison, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing murmur of voices around us. Please, don't let this happen. I'm your sister. I looked at her, this woman who had shared my childhood, who had held my hand at our parents' funeral, who had promised we'd always be family no matter what. I looked at her, and I saw a stranger wearing my sister's face. Yes, I said quietly, my voice carrying further than I intended in the hushed room. You are my sister, and that's exactly why this hurts so much. Then I walked toward the exit, leaving Emma standing alone in the middle of her ruined graduation party, finally facing the consequences of her choices without me there to shield her from the fallout. But as I reached the door, I realized that Kyle's revelation had changed everything. This was no longer a private family matter that could be resolved through quiet legal channels. This was now a public scandal that would follow Emma wherever she went in her medical career. And despite everything she'd done to me, despite all, the lies and theft and manipulation, I wasn't sure I was prepared for the complete destruction of my sister's future. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but I could still hear the growing buzz of shocked conversation from inside the ballroom. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the way things were before. For better or worse, the truth was finally out. The parking garage was dimly lit and echoing with the sound of my heels against concrete as I walked toward my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my keys. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow sensation in my chest and the beginnings of what I suspected might be regret. Behind me, the muffled sounds of chaos drifted from the country. Club, raised voices, car doors slamming, the unmistakable buzz of scandal spreading through what had been, moments before, a refined social gathering. I'd left Emma standing in the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, but I hadn't stayed to watch the full extent of the damage unfold. My phone buzzed as I reached my Honda Civic, parked between a Mercedes and a BMW in a section that made my modest car look even more out of place than usual. The caller ID showed Jason Torres, my private investigator. Madison, his voice was tight with concern when I answered. I just got a call from Kyle. What the hell happened in there? I leaned against my car, suddenly feeling exhausted. He wasn't supposed to make a public announcement, Jason. That wasn't part of the plan. Yeah, no kidding. Kyle said he panicked when he saw Emma trying to manipulate you again. He thought if he exposed everything publicly, it would prevent her from convincing you to back down. Jason paused. Madison, there are videos. People were recording his speech. This is going to be all over social media within hours. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't going to be a quiet legal matter handled through proper channels. This was going to be a public scandal that would follow Emma for the rest of her career, assuming she had a career left to follow. What have I done? I whispered, more to myself than to Jason. You exposed a fraud, he said firmly. Emma made her choices, Madison. She stole from you, lied to you, manipulated you for years. What happened tonight was a consequence of her actions, not yours. But even as he spoke, I could picture Emma's face in those final moments. The terror, the desperation, the complete collapse of everything she'd worked for. Whatever she'd done to me, whatever she'd stolen or lied about, she was still the girl who had crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who had helped me plant flowers on our parents' grave every year, on the anniversary of their death. Jason, I need you to do something for me, I said suddenly. What? I need you to find out exactly how bad this is going to be for her. The medical school, the residency program, the state licensing board. I need to know what she's facing. There was a pause. Madison, are you having second thoughts about the complaints you filed? Was I? The question hung in the air as I watched a stream of well-dressed people exit the country club, many of them glancing at their phones, clearly already reading about or watching videos of what had just happened inside. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe. I need to understand what I've set in motion. I'll make some calls, Jason said. But Madison, be very careful here. Emma's had years to perfect her manipulation tactics on you. Don't let guilt make you forget what she did. After hanging up, I sat in my car for several minutes, listening to the sound of my own breathing and watching people leave the party in clusters, their animated conversations carrying across the parking garage. Through the tall windows of the country club, I could see figures moving around inside, could imagine the chaos Emma was dealing with. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a number I didn't recognize. This is Kyle. Emma's locked, herself in the bathroom. The party's basically over. Dr. Webb left without saying goodbye to her. I think we need to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, where? Coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. Starbucks near the hospital. 30 minutes? I hesitated, then replied, I'll be there. The drive through downtown Chicago gave me time to think, though my thoughts kept circling without reaching any clear conclusions. 24 hours ago, I'd been certain about my course of action. Emma had betrayed me systematically and completely, and she deserved to face the consequences. But seeing her total destruction play out in public had left me questioning whether justice and revenge were the same thing, and whether I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Kyle was already waiting when I arrived at the coffee shop, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that managed to be both guilty and defiant. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 26 or 27, with sandy brown hair and the kind of earnest face that suggested he wasn't naturally suited for deception. Madison, he said as I sat down across from him, I owe you an apology. For what? Doing exactly what I hired you to do? For doing it the wrong way. Jason told me to gather information and document Emma's lies, not to blow up her entire life in front of 100 people. Kyle pushed one of the coffee cups toward me. I got emotional. When I saw her treating you like that, dismissing you after everything you'd done for her, I snapped. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to focus on, besides the guilt that was eating at my stomach. Tell me what happened after I left. Kyle's expression darkened. It was bad, Madison. Really bad. People were taking pictures, recording videos, posting on social media. Emma's name was trending on Twitter within an hour, and not in a good way. Medical student exposed for fraud was the general theme. What about her residency? Dr. Webb pulled her aside before he left. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know that the research position is off the table. He mentioned something about needing to report the situation to the hospital's ethics board. Kyle leaned forward, his voice dropping. Madison, there's something else. Emma's not just facing professional consequences. Someone at the party recognized the trust fund situation and started talking about potential criminal charges. The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. Criminal charges? Forgery, fraud, theft. The amounts involved push it into felony territory. In Illinois, if the state attorney's office decides to pursue it. Kyle didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I sat back in my chair, feeling like the walls of the coffee shop were closing in around me. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? Justice for Emma's betrayal, consequences for her actions, an end to years of manipulation and theft. So why did I feel like I was the one who had done something unforgivable? Where is she now? I asked. Still at the club, as far as I know. Last I saw, she was on the phone with someone, probably her lawyer, if she's smart. Kyle studied my face carefully. Madison, can I ask you something? Why did you hire me? I mean, really? Was it about getting your money back, or was it about making Emma pay? The question hit harder than I'd expected. I'd told myself it was about justice, about protecting myself from further manipulation, about ensuring Emma faced appropriate consequences for her actions. But sitting there in the harsh fluorescent light of the coffee shop, I had to confront the possibility that my motives hadn't been as pure as I'd claimed. I don't know, I said honestly. Both, maybe, does it matter? It matters if you're having second thoughts about what happens next. Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's number, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But something, guilt, curiosity, or maybe just the remnants of sisterly concern, made me swipe to accept the call. Madison. Emma's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and raw from crying. Please, I need to see you. Emma. Please, I'm begging you. Just give me 5 minutes to explain, to apologize, to say goodbye, if that's what this is. The desperation in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from her, stripped of all the calculated manipulation she usually employed. This was pure, raw fear. Where are you? Still at the club. Everyone's gone, but they're letting me stay until. Her voice broke. Until I figure out what to do next. I looked at Kyle, who was watching me with an expression of concern mixed with disapproval. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. Madison, don't, Kyle started, but I was already standing. This is something I have to do, I said. Whatever Emma did, whatever she deserves, she's still my sister. I need to hear what she has to say. Kyle shook his head. She's going to try to manipulate you again. That's what she does. Maybe, I admitted. But I need to know if there's anything left of the sister I used to love, or if that person was always just another one of Emma's performances. The drive back to the country club felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to staff and Emma's white BMW sitting alone under a light post like a monument to fallen dreams. I found Emma in the same ballroom where her graduation party had taken place just hours earlier. The room was being cleaned by staff, chairs stacked and tables cleared, the detritus of celebration swept away. Emma sat alone at a table near the windows, still wearing her ivory dress but looking like a ghost of herself. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she lifted a glass of water to her lips. Madison, she said when she saw me, and the relief in her voice was palpable. You came. I sat down across from her, maintaining some distance. You said you had something to explain. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue that was already shredded from use. I know you probably think I'm going to try to manipulate you again, to find some way to make this your fault or convince you to help me fix it. Aren't you? No. The word came out flat, defeated. I can't fix this, Madison. What happened tonight? It's over. My residency, my medical career, probably my freedom if they decide to press criminal charges. It's all over. I studied her face, looking for signs of the calculated performance I'd grown so used to, but all I saw was genuine despair. Then why did you ask me to come? Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I wanted to tell you that you were right. About everything. About what I did. About who I became. About the fact that I destroyed the most important relationship in my life for money and status and things that don't actually matter. She turned to look at me directly, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her eyes that looked like the sister I remembered from childhood. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry, and that I know sorry isn't enough. I wanted you to know that losing your respect, losing your love, that's the worst consequence of all this. Worse than losing my career or going to prison or having my name dragged through the mud on social media. Emma reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. And I wanted to give you this. I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a handwritten letter, several pages long, in Emma's familiar handwriting. What is it? A confession. Everything I did, every lie I told, every dollar I stole, every signature I forged, all of it. I wrote it tonight while I was sitting here waiting for you. Emma's voice was steady now, resigned. I'm going to give copies to the police, to the medical board, to Northwestern, to everyone who needs to know the truth. I stared at the letter, scanning the detailed admissions of fraud and manipulation written in my sister's careful script. Why? I asked. Because you shouldn't have to carry the burden of exposing me. Because what I did was wrong, and I should be the one to admit it. And because, Emma's voice broke again, because maybe if I take responsibility for what I've done, you'll be able to forgive me someday. Not now, maybe not for years, but someday. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt tears prick my eyes. This was the Emma I remembered. The sister who had taken the blame when we broke our mother's favorite vase, who had stood up to bullies who picked on me in elementary school, who had promised at our parents' funeral that we'd take care of each other no matter what. But it was also too little, too late. Emma, I said softly, forgiveness isn't something you can earn by finally telling the truth when you have no other choice. She nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I know, but I had to try. We sat, in silence for several minutes, two sisters in a ballroom full of ghosts, surrounded by the wreckage of trust and love and family bonds that couldn't be repaired with apologies or confessions or good intentions. Finally, Emma spoke again. Madison, can I ask you one favor? I waited. When this all comes out in the news, when people start asking questions about our family, about what kind of people we are. She paused, struggling with the words. Will you tell them that I wasn't always like this? That there was a time when I was a good sister who loved you and would have done anything for you? The question broke something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer force of will. The tears came then, years of hurt and betrayal, and lost love pouring out in great shuddering sobs that I couldn't control. Emma started to reach across the table toward me, then stopped, her hand hovering in the space between us like a bridge that could never be rebuilt. Yes, I whispered through my tears. I'll tell them that. And in that moment, I realized that justice and forgiveness weren't mutually exclusive. Emma would face the consequences of her actions. The legal system would ensure that. But I could also remember the sister she'd been before greed and desperation corrupted her. Could honor the good parts of our relationship while still protecting myself from further harm. It wasn't the ending either of us had wanted, but it was the ending we'd earned through our choices and actions and the paths we'd chosen to walk. Sometimes, that's the best you can hope for from a family tragedy. Not redemption or reconciliation, but understanding and the possibility of peace. 3 days after Emma's graduation party, I was sitting in my apartment at 7 a.m, staring at my laptop screen in disbelief. The story had exploded across the internet with a speed and ferocity that I hadn't anticipated. Med school fraud was trending on Twitter, and Emma's name was being discussed on medical forums, finance blogs, and even major news outlets. The Chicago Tribune had picked up the story with the headline, Medical Student's Graduation Turned Nightmare, Sister exposes years of financial fraud. CNN's medical correspondent had done a segment on ethics in medical education. BuzzFeed had published an article titled, "This medical student's sister paid for her education, then got told she didn't belong at graduation. What happened next will shock you?" But it was the TikTok videos that really drove home how completely Emma's life had been destroyed. Someone had recorded Kyle's entire speech at the graduation party, and it had been viewed over 2 million times. The comments ranged from supportive messages for me to savage criticism of Emma, with very little middle ground. My phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, old friends, distant relatives who'd seen the news, even a few talk show producers asking if I'd be willing to appear on their programs. I'd turned them all down, but the attention was overwhelming. The knock on my door at 7:15 a.m. was firm and official sounding. When I looked through the peephole, I saw 2 people in business suits, a middle-aged black woman with graying hair and a younger white man with a serious expression. They held up badges. "Ms. Parker, I'm Detective Angela Rodriguez with the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. This is Detective Michael Chen. We'd like to speak with you about the allegations involving your sister, Emma Mitchell." I'd been expecting this call ever since Kyle had mentioned potential criminal charges, but having detectives at my door made everything feel suddenly, unavoidably real. "Of course," I said, unlocking the deadbolt. "Please come in. My apartment was small but neat, a 1-bedroom in Lincoln Park that I'd chosen more for affordability than luxury. The contrast with Emma's lifestyle couldn't have been more stark, and I found myself wondering if the detectives noticed the secondhand furniture and discount store decorations. Detective Rodriguez settled into my worn armchair while Detective Chen took out a notepad and digital recorder. Both of them had the careful, professional demeanor of people who dealt with family financial crimes regularly. "First, let me say that we understand this must be a difficult situation for you," Detective Rodriguez began. "Family financial crimes are always complicated, and we want to make sure we have all the facts before proceeding." "I appreciate that," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I meant it. "We've received your sister's written confession, as well as the documentation provided by your private investigator," Detective Chen said, consulting his notes. "The evidence appears substantial. Forged signatures, unauthorized access to trust funds, systematic financial fraud spanning approximately 2 years." Detective Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "What we need to understand is your intent in gathering this evidence. Were you planning to pursue criminal charges from the beginning, or was this initially intended to be a civil matter?" The question I'd been dreading. How could I explain that I'd wanted justice without necessarily wanting to destroy Emma's life completely? How could I admit that part of me had been motivated by hurt and anger, even if I'd told myself it was about protecting others from her manipulations? "Initially, I just wanted to understand what was happening," I said carefully. "The discrepancies in our accounts, Emma's lifestyle versus what she was telling me about her financial situation. I hired the private investigator to get clarity. And when did you decide to file formal complaints with Northwestern University and the State Medical Board?" After I discovered the extent of the fraud, it wasn't just about the money, though that was significant. It was about the pattern of deception and what that meant for Emma's fitness to practice medicine. Detective Chen made notes while Detective Rodriguez studied my face with the intensity of someone trained to read people's motivations. "Ms. Parker, I want to be direct with you about something," she said. "The evidence you've provided is more than sufficient for us to file felony charges against your sister. In Illinois, the amounts involved, over $70,000, constitute grand theft. The forged signatures add additional charges of forgery and fraud. We're looking at potential prison time of 3 to 7 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 3 to 7 years. Emma, who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket, facing years in prison because of my investigation. However," Detective Rodriguez continued, "the state attorney's office has some discretion in cases involving family members, especially when there's clear evidence of remorse and willingness to make restitution. Your sister's confession and her cooperation with our investigation count in her favor. What does that mean exactly? It means we have options, Detective Chen said. We could pursue full prosecution, which would likely result in felony convictions and significant prison time. Or we could work with the state attorney's office to negotiate a plea agreement, reduce charges, restitution requirements, probation, community service. Detective Rodriguez leaned back in her chair. But that decision partly depends on you, Ms. Parker. As the victim, your preferences carry weight with the prosecutor's office. If you're primarily interested in recovering your losses and ensuring this doesn't happen again, we can work toward a resolution that focuses on restitution rather than punishment. The choice they were offering me felt impossibly heavy. Emma had betrayed me systematically and completely, had stolen my inheritance and manipulated me for years. She deserved to face consequences for her actions. But did she deserve to have her entire life destroyed? Did she deserve years in prison? Can I have some time to think about it? I asked. Of course, Detective Rodriguez said, standing. But don't wait too long. The media attention means there's pressure to move forward quickly with charges. If we're going to negotiate alternatives, it needs to happen soon. After the detectives left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I tried to process what they'd told me. The power to determine Emma's fate was now literally in my hands, and I had no idea what the right choice was. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason Torres. Saw the news coverage. You okay? Need anything? I typed back. Can you meet? Need to talk. Through some things. Coffee shop near your apartment in an hour? Yes. Jason was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his usual black coffee and serious expression. He'd been my anchor through this entire process, the one person who'd helped me navigate the investigation without judgment or agenda. Madison, he said as I sat down. You look like hell. Thanks for the pep talk, I said, managing a weak smile. The police were at my apartment this morning. I figured they would be. What did they want? I explained the conversation with the detectives, the options they'd presented, the choice I now faced about Emma's prosecution. Jason listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a small pad he always carried. So, he said when I finished, what are you thinking? I don't know. That's the problem. 6 months ago, I would have said Emma deserved whatever consequences came her way. But seeing her at the graduation party, seeing how completely her life fell apart, I keep wondering if there's a difference between justice and revenge. Jason was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Can I tell you something about my experience as a cop and now as a PI? I nodded. The cases that haunted me weren't the ones where bad people got punished. They were the ones where good people got destroyed by their own worst decisions, and where the punishment was so far out of proportion to the crime that it became its own injustice. Are you saying Emma's a good person who made bad decisions? I'm saying that's a question only you can answer. You know her better than anyone. Is the Emma who stole from you the real Emma? Or is the real Emma the sister who took care of you after your parents died, who used to call you crying about medical school stress, who wrote that confession letter? The question hit at the heart of everything I'd been struggling with. Who was the real Emma? The manipulative fraud who'd systematically stolen from me, or the sister who'd held my hand at our parents' funeral? Maybe she's both, I said quietly. Maybe she is. And maybe that's okay. People are complicated, Madison. They can be capable of genuine love and terrible betrayal at the same time. The question isn't whether Emma deserves punishment. She does. The question is what kind of punishment serves justice rather than just satisfying anger. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Emma's number appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Madison? Emma's voice was small, tentative. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I needed to tell you something. What? I just got off the phone with my lawyer. The police want to meet with me tomorrow about the charges. He says I could be looking at prison time. I closed my eyes, not trusting myself to speak. Madison, I'm not calling to ask you to help me or to try to manipulate you into changing your mind about the prosecution. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you ever again. Then why are you calling? Because I wanted you to know that whatever happens to me, I'm grateful that you exposed what I was doing. Not grateful for the consequences. I'm terrified of those. But grateful that you stopped me before I hurt anyone else. Before I became someone even worse than I already am. Emma's voice was thick with tears, but she kept talking. I've been seeing a therapist since the graduation party, Dr. Sarah Kim. She specializes in family dynamics and financial abuse. She's helping me understand how I justified what I was doing to you, how I convinced myself that I was entitled to take from you because of some twisted idea about fairness and family obligations. This was the first I'd heard about Emma seeking therapy, and it surprised me. She says I displayed classic patterns of financial abuse, isolation, manipulation, gaslighting, exploitation of family loyalty. She says what I did to you was a form of domestic abuse, just not romantic domestic abuse. The clinical terminology made Emma's betrayal sound both more serious and somehow less personal, as if it were a syndrome rather than a choice. Madison, I want you to know that I understand. Now what I put you through, not just the money, though that was terrible enough, but the psychological manipulation, the way I made you doubt your own perceptions, the way I used your love for me as a weapon against you. I found myself crying without having realized. I'd started, tears streaming down my face in the middle of the coffee shop while Jason watched with concern. Emma. No, let me finish. Please. I need to say this. Emma's voice was steadier now, more determined. I know the police gave you a choice about how they proceed with the charges. My lawyer told me. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll accept it. If you think I need to go to prison to face the consequences of what I did, then that's what should happen. If you think there's another way for me to make amends and ensure I never hurt anyone like this again, then I'll do whatever that requires. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. But most importantly, I want you to know that I love you. I know I have a terrible way of showing it, and I know love doesn't excuse what I did. But you've been the most important person in my life since we were children, and losing your respect and trust is the worst consequence of all my terrible choices. The line went quiet except for the sound of both of us crying. Emma, I said finally, I love you too. That's what makes this so hard. I know, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Madison, for everything. After hanging up, I sat with Jason in silence for several minutes, processing Emma's words and trying to figure out what they meant for my decision about the prosecution. She's in therapy, I said finally. That's good. It suggests she's serious about understanding and changing her behavior rather than just sorry she got caught. But does it change anything? Does therapy undo the years of manipulation and theft? Jason considered the question carefully. No, it doesn't undo anything, but it might prevent future harm, both to you and to others. The question is whether that matters to you in terms of how she should be punished. I stared out the window at the Chicago street, watching people go about their normal lives, unaware of the family drama playing out in the coffee shop. In a few hours, I would need to make a choice that would determine the course of Emma's life, and probably my own. The weight of that responsibility felt almost unbearable, but as I sat there, I began to realize that maybe the choice wasn't as binary as I'd been thinking. Maybe there was a way to hold Emma accountable for her actions, while still allowing for the possibility of redemption and repair. Maybe justice didn't have to mean destruction, even when someone deserved to be destroyed. The question was whether I had the strength to choose mercy over revenge, especially when Emma had given me every reason to choose the harsher path. The law offices of Brennan, Walsh and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. I'd never been in such an expensive legal office before, and the marble floors, mahogany paneling, and oil paintings of distinguished-looking judges made me acutely aware that this meeting would determine not just Emma's future, but potentially drain whatever remained of our family's resources. Attorney David Walsh was a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of measured speaking style that probably cost $500 an hour. He'd been recommended by Jason as someone who specialized in white-collar criminal defense and had experience negotiating with prosecutors in family financial fraud cases. "Ms. Parker," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this situation is difficult for everyone involved." I settled into the chair, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "I want to understand all the options before I make my decision about the prosecution." "Of course. Let me lay out where things stand." Walsh opened a thick file and pulled out several documents. "The Cook County State Attorney's Office has reviewed the evidence and is prepared to file multiple felony charges against your sister: grand theft, forgery, fraud, and unlawful use of financial transaction devices. The minimum sentence would be 3 years, but given the amount involved and the sophisticated nature of the deception, we could be looking at 5 to 7 years in prison." The numbers hit me like a physical blow, even though Detective Rodriguez had mentioned similar timeframes. Hearing it from Emma's defense attorney somehow made it more real. "However," Walsh continued, "the prosecutor, Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Kim, has indicated she's willing to consider alternative arrangements if certain conditions are met." "What kind of conditions?" Walsh consulted his notes. "Full restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties, approximately $95,000 total. A guilty plea to reduced charges, likely gross misdemeanor theft rather than felony charges. 3 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service. And most importantly, your agreement as the victim that these terms serve the interests of justice." I tried to process the numbers. $95,000 was more than Emma could possibly have, especially now that her medical career was effectively over. How would she pay restitution of that amount? "That's where it gets complicated," Walsh admitted. "Emma has approximately $12,000 in savings and checking accounts. The condo she shares with her boyfriend could be sold, but her share of the equity would only cover about $20,000. Her car is worth maybe $15,000. That's less than half of what she owes." "Correct. The remainder would need to be paid through a structured payment plan over the term of her probation. Emma would need to find employment and dedicate a significant portion of her income to restitution payments." The idea of Emma, who had lived in luxury for years on my money, working at some regular job to pay me back, struck me as both appropriate and somehow sad. "What about her medical career? The residency, the licensing board investigation?" Walsh's expression grew grim. "The residency is gone. Northwestern Hospital terminated her position immediately after her confession became public. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation has opened a formal investigation into her fitness to practice medicine. Even if the criminal charges are reduced, the ethical violations will likely prevent her from obtaining a medical license in Illinois, and possibly anywhere else. So 4 years of medical school, all that debt, all that training, gone? Almost certainly yes. Medical licensing boards don't have much tolerance for financial fraud, regardless of the family circumstances." I stared out the window at Lake Michigan, watching sailboats drift across the water like white specks against the blue. Emma had worked so hard to become a doctor, had dreamed of it since she was a child playing with toy stethoscopes. The irony that her attempts to secure her medical career had ultimately destroyed it wasn't lost on me. "Mr. Walsh, can I ask you something off the record?" "Of course." In your professional opinion, if Emma accepts this plea agreement, is she likely to reoffend? To commit similar crimes against other family members or people who trust her? Walsh was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. That's a difficult question to answer definitively. However, I will say that in my experience, family financial crimes often stem from specific circumstances: desperation, opportunity, perceived justification, rather than from inherent criminality. Your sister's case fits that pattern. Meaning? Meaning she didn't steal from strangers or commit random acts of fraud. She manipulated a specific relationship with someone who loved and trusted her, using that trust to justify increasingly elaborate deceptions. It's terrible behavior, but it's different from, say, a career criminal who defrauds elderly victims or runs investment scams. Walsh leaned forward slightly. The fact that she confessed voluntarily, sought therapy immediately, and has shown genuine remorse rather than trying to minimize her actions, those are positive indicators. But ultimately, you know her better than I do. A knock on the office door interrupted our conversation. Walsh's secretary appeared in the doorway with an apologetic expression. Mr. Walsh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who says she needs to speak with Ms. Parker. She says it's urgent. Before Walsh could respond, Emma appeared behind the secretary, looking pale and determined. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, casual clothes that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the polished medical student persona I was used to seeing. Madison, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious anxiety in her eyes. I know I'm not supposed to contact you directly while the legal proceedings are pending, but I need to tell you something. Walsh looked alarmed. Emma, I strongly advise against— It's okay, I said, surprising myself. Let her speak. Emma stepped into the office but remained near the door, as if afraid to come too close. I want to withdraw from the plea negotiations. Walsh and I both stared at her in shock. Emma, what are you talking about? Walsh said. We've been working for weeks to avoid prison time. I want to plead guilty to the original charges, Emma said, her voice growing stronger. No plea bargain, no reduced sentences. I want to accept full responsibility for what I did and serve whatever sentence the court thinks is appropriate. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Emma, that could mean years in prison. No? She finally moved closer, taking the chair next to mine. Madison, I've been thinking about this for days, and I realized something. As long as there's a plea bargain, as long as the consequences are reduced, part of me will always believe that what I did wasn't that serious. Part of me will find ways to justify it or minimize it. Walsh was frantically taking notes, clearly, trying to figure out how to manage his client's apparent self-destruction. Emma, he said carefully, I understand you want to take responsibility, but there are ways to do that without destroying your entire future. My future was already destroyed the moment I chose to steal from my sister, Emma interrupted. The plea bargain doesn't change that. It just lets me pretend that the consequences aren't as severe as they should be. She turned to look at me directly. Madison, for years I convinced myself that taking your money was okay, because I was going to pay you back, because I needed it more than you did, because you were being too cautious with your finances. I had a justification for everything. Emma's voice was calm now, almost serene. If I accept a reduced sentence, I'll spend the rest of my life telling myself that the punishment wasn't that bad, which means what I did wasn't that bad. I'll find new ways to justify my actions, new ways to avoid fully confronting what I did to you. Emma, you could go to prison for 5 years or more, I said, unable to hide the distress in my voice. Maybe that's what I need, she replied. Maybe I need consequences that are serious enough that I can't rationalize them away, or convince myself that I've paid my debt with community service and monthly payments. Walsh looked like he was having a heart attack. Emma, as your attorney, I cannot recommend this course of action. You have a chance to avoid felony convictions, to avoid prison time, to rebuild your life. What life? Emma's voice rose slightly. I can't practice medicine. My reputation is destroyed. The person I was becoming, someone who could steal from her own sister and sleep at night, that's not someone whose life is worth rebuilding. She looked at me again, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen since we were children. Complete honesty, without calculation or manipulation. Madison, I know this sounds crazy, but I think going to prison might save me. Not from legal consequences. I deserve those. But from becoming someone who's capable of hurting people I love and then finding ways to justify it. The room fell silent, except for the sound of traffic 32 floors below. Walsh was staring at his client like she'd lost her mind, and I was trying to process what Emma was saying and what it meant. There's something else, Emma said quietly. Something I need to tell you that I haven't told anyone else, not even Mr. Walsh. I braced myself for another revelation. The therapy I've been doing with Dr. Kim, she helped me realize that what I did to you wasn't just about medical school or money or keeping up with my classmates. It was about power and control. Emma's hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. I liked having power over you, Madison. I liked knowing that I could manipulate you into working yourself to exhaustion for my benefit. I liked feeling superior to you, even while I was depending on you for everything. There was part of me that enjoyed watching you sacrifice for my dreams while I lived in luxury. The admission hit me like a slap. I'd suspected that Emma's manipulations were calculated, but hearing her admit that she'd actually enjoyed my suffering was almost unbearable. That's who I was becoming, Emma continued. Someone who could take pleasure in exploiting the people who loved me most. And the scary thing is, if you hadn't exposed me, I think I would have kept going. I would have found new ways to take from you, new justifications, new manipulations. She wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Prison won't just be punishment for what I did. It'll be protection for you and anyone else who might trust me in the future. It'll be time for me to figure out how to become someone who's worthy of the love you've shown me, even when I was busy betraying it. Walsh had stopped taking notes and was staring at Emma with a mixture of professional frustration and what might have been grudging respect. Emma, he said finally, if you're determined to pursue this course of action, I have an ethical obligation to make sure you understand the full implications. A felony conviction will follow you for the rest of your life. Employment opportunities, housing applications, professional licenses, everything will be affected. I understand, Emma said, and the sentencing could be at the high end of the range, especially if the judge perceives your crimes as particularly calculating or harmful. I understand that too. Walsh turned to me. Ms. Parker, your sister is essentially asking the court to impose the harshest possible sentence. As the victim, your input will carry significant weight with the judge. If she's determined to plead guilty to the original charges, your recommendation about sentencing could mean the difference between 3 years and 7 years in prison. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. Emma was asking for the maximum consequences, but the final decision about how severe those consequences would be was still partly mine to make. Emma, I said slowly, are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Not what you think you deserve, not what you think will make me forgive you, but what you actually want for your life. Emma considered the question seriously before answering. Madison, I've spent the last 4 years of my life lying to everyone, including myself. This is the first completely honest decision I've made in years. Yes, I want to face the full consequences of what I did. Not because I think it will fix everything, but because I think it's the only way I can learn to live with myself. She stood up, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that reminded me of our mother preparing to face difficult situations. Mr. Walsh, please prepare whatever paperwork is necessary for me to change my plea. And Madison, She paused, looking at me with an expression of love and regret that broke my heart. Whatever you decide to recommend for sentencing, I'll accept it. You've earned the right to determine what justice looks like in this situation. After Emma left, Walsh and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. In 30 years of criminal defense work, I've never had a client insist on pleading guilty to charges that could send them to prison for years when we had a viable alternative. I'm not sure whether your sister is demonstrating remarkable moral courage or having some kind of psychological breakdown. Maybe both, I said quietly. The question now is what you're going to recommend to the judge at sentencing. Emma's right, that your input will be crucial. I stared out at Lake Michigan again, watching the afternoon light dance on the water. In a few weeks, I would stand in a courtroom and help determine whether Emma spent 3 years or 7 years in prison. The power to show mercy or demand harsh justice was entirely in my hands. The question was, which choice would actually serve justice, and which would simply satisfy my desire for revenge? As I sat in that expensive law office, I realized that the hardest part of this entire ordeal wasn't discovering Emma's betrayal or exposing her crimes. The hardest part was figuring out how to be both a victim seeking justice and a sister capable of forgiveness. And I was running out of time to decide which role mattered more. The week between Emma's decision to reject the plea deal and her formal sentencing hearing passed in a blur of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. I'd taken time off work, something I rarely did, but I couldn't concentrate on spreadsheets and tax returns when my sister's fate hung in the balance of a decision I still hadn't made. On Thursday morning, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Madison Parker? The voice was elderly, warm, and vaguely familiar. Yes, this is Madison. This is Helen Cartwright. I was your parents' neighbor when you and Emma were growing up on Maple Street. I saw the news about Emma, and I wanted to talk. To you, Mrs. Cartwright. The memory came flooding back. A kind, elderly woman who'd lived next door to our family home, who'd brought casseroles after our parents died, and had always asked about our progress when she saw us around the neighborhood during college breaks. Mrs. Cartwright, of course. How are you? I'm well, dear, though I have to say I've been troubled by what I've been reading about your family's situation. That's why I'm calling. I settled into my kitchen chair, curious about what our former neighbor might have to say about Emma's crimes. Madison, I want to tell you something that I probably should have shared years ago, but I wasn't sure it was my place. It's about the months after your parents died when you were taking care of Emma. Something in her tone made me sit up straighter. What about those months? I want you to know that I watched you, dear. Every day I saw you leaving for work before dawn and coming home after dark. I saw you in the yard on weekends trying to maintain your parents' garden while Emma was inside studying. I saw you walking to the grocery store because you'd sold your car to help pay for Emma's college applications. The memories she was describing felt like they belonged to someone else, a younger, more optimistic version of myself who'd believed that sacrifice would be rewarded with gratitude and love. Mrs. Cartwright, I appreciate you remembering. But, please, let me finish, dear. What you need to know is that Emma saw it too. I went quiet. One afternoon, this was maybe 6 months after the funeral, I was in my garden when Emma came outside. She couldn't see me behind the hedge, but I could hear her on the phone with someone. She was laughing, Madison. Laughing about how easy it was to get you to do things for her. My stomach clenched. She said, and I remember this clearly because it shocked me so much. She said, Madison thinks she's being the responsible big sister. But really, she's just proving how much smarter I am than her. She'll work herself to death if I cry. Hard enough? The words hit me like physical blows. I'd suspected that Emma's gratitude had been performance, but hearing that she'd been mocking my sacrifices even then, even when we were both still grieving our parents, was almost unbearable. Mrs. Cartwright, why are you telling me this now? Because I've been reading about Emma's crimes and about how she's now claiming to want the maximum punishment, And I'm worried that she's manipulating you again. What do you mean? Think about it, dear. Emma spent years convincing you that she was grateful for your help, that she needed you, that family meant everything to her. Now she's convinced you that she's genuinely remorseful, that she wants to face harsh consequences, that prison will somehow redeem her. Mrs. Cartwright's voice grew more urgent. But what if this is just another performance? What if she's figured out that playing the role of the repentant sister will get her more sympathy than trying to minimize her crimes? What if she's counting on your compassion to recommend a lighter sentence, thinking that her apparent acceptance of punishment will make you want to protect her? The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but now that Mrs. Cartwright had raised it, I couldn't shake it. Was Emma's dramatic rejection of the plea deal just another manipulation, a calculated gamble that her apparent moral courage would inspire me to recommend mercy? Mrs. Cartwright, even if that's true, Emma can't fake her way through years in prison. If she gets the maximum sentence, she'll serve every day of it regardless of her motivations. That's true, dear, but she might be betting that you won't let it get that far. She might be counting on you to step in at the last minute with a recommendation for the minimum sentence, thinking that her apparent willingness to accept harsh punishment proves she's changed. After hanging up with Mrs. Cartwright, I found myself questioning everything I'd believed about Emma's transformation. Was her confession genuine, or was it strategic? Was her therapy real personal growth, or was it ammunition for another manipulation? I needed perspective, so I called the one person who'd been with me through this entire ordeal. Jason, I need to see you. Something's come up. We met at our usual coffee shop, and I told him about Mrs. Cartwright's call and the doubts it had raised. About Emma's motivations. Jason, what if Emma's playing me again? What if this whole repentant sister act is just another con? Jason stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Madison, can I ask you something? Of course. Does it matter? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, regardless of Emma's motivations, what are the actual options here? She's going to plead guilty to felony charges. She's going to face significant prison time. Her medical career is over, her reputation is destroyed, and she'll be paying restitution for years. Jason leaned forward. Whether she's genuinely repentant or just playing another angle, the consequences are real. The question is whether you want those consequences to be on the lighter end or the harsher end of the spectrum. But if she's manipulating me, then she's manipulating you into making a decision about justice that you have to live with either way. The manipulation doesn't change the fact that you have to decide what kind of justice serves your needs and society's needs. Jason was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. There's something else, I said. I've been getting calls from other people who knew Emma, her college roommate, some of her medical school classmates, even Kyle. What are they saying? Mixed things. Her roommate said Emma used to borrow money and forget to pay it back. One of her classmates said Emma always seemed to have more spending money than made sense for someone on a student budget. But Kyle? I paused. Kyle said something interesting. What? He said that in the weeks before the graduation party, Emma had been having nightmares. She'd wake up crying, saying she was a terrible person, that she didn't deserve her success. He thought it was just pre-graduation anxiety, but now he wonders if it was guilt. Jason nodded. Guilt would suggest genuine remorse. Or it could suggest fear of getting caught. We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the Chicago afternoon bustle past the coffee shop windows. Madison, Jason said finally, I think you're asking the wrong question. What should I be asking? Instead of trying to figure out whether Emma's remorse is genuine, ask yourself what outcome would allow you to move forward with your life. What sentence would let you feel like justice was served without making you feel like you'd destroyed your sister out of anger? The question was simpler and more complex than anything I'd been considering. That evening, I received another unexpected call. This one was from Dr. Sarah Kim, Emma's therapist. Ms. Parker, I hope you don't mind me calling. Emma signed a release allowing me to speak with you about her treatment. Of course, Dr. Kim. What can you tell me? I want to be clear that I can't discuss the details of Emma's therapy sessions, but I can share some general observations about her progress and mental state. I'd appreciate that. Emma has been attending sessions twice a week since the incident. At her graduation party. In my professional opinion, her remorse and desire for accountability appear genuine. How can you be sure? Several factors. First, she initiated therapy voluntarily rather than being court-ordered. Second, she's been completely honest about her actions, including details that make her look worse rather than better. Third, she's demonstrated insight into the psychological patterns that led to her behavior. Dr. Kim paused. Most importantly, she's not trying to minimize her actions or shift blame. In my experience, people who are manipulating the therapeutic process typically focus on external factors that led to their behavior. Emma has been focused entirely on understanding her own choices and motivations. What about her decision to reject the plea deal? That's actually what convinced me that her remorse is genuine. Someone who was still manipulating the situation would have taken the reduced charges and tried to move on with minimal consequences. Emma's insistence on facing full punishment suggests she's prioritizing moral accountability over self-interest. Dr. Kim's assessment was reassuring, but I still had doubts. Dr. Kim, is it possible that Emma is manipulating you as well? That she's performing remorse to gain credibility with someone who might influence the court proceedings? It's possible, Dr. Kim admitted. But I've been treating people with personality disorders and manipulative behaviors for 15 years. Emma's presentation is consistent with genuine remorse and moral injury, not with calculated deception. Moral injury? It's a concept from military psychology that applies to civilians as well. It occurs when someone commits acts that violate their own moral code so severely that they experience lasting psychological damage. Emma is exhibiting classic symptoms: intrusive thoughts about her actions, profound shame, difficulty sleeping, loss of sense of self-worth. Is that treatable? With time and consistent therapy, yes. But it requires the person to fully accept responsibility for their actions and commit to making amends. Emma appears to be doing both. After ending the call with Dr. Kim, I found myself more confused than ever. The professional opinion supported Emma's apparent transformation, but Mrs. Cartwright's warnings about manipulation echoed in my mind. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Madison, this is Emma's medical school friend Jessica. Chen, can we talk? I have something important to tell you about Emma that might help with your decision. I called the number immediately. Jessica? Madison, thank you for calling. I've been debating whether to reach out, but I think you should know about something that happened during Emma's 3rd year of medical school. What happened? Emma and I were study partners, and one night she broke down crying while we were preparing for our clinical rotations exam. She confessed that she'd been lying to you about her financial situation, that she'd been living off your money while telling you she was struggling. This wasn't new information, but I let Jessica continue. What you might not know is that she asked me what she should do. She said she wanted to tell you the truth but was terrified that you'd stop supporting her education. She said she felt trapped between her dreams and her conscience. What did you tell her? I told her she had to come clean, that the deception was eating her alive and would only get worse. I offered to help her figure out how to approach you, how to explain the situation, and ask for forgiveness. What happened? Jessica's voice grew sad. She seemed relieved, like she'd finally decided to do the right thing. She said she'd call you that weekend and tell you everything. But then Monday came, and when I asked her about it, she'd changed. Her mind. She said she'd realized that telling you would hurt you unnecessarily, that it was better to just work harder and pay you back without you ever knowing. And you believed that? At the time, I wanted to. Emma was my friend, and I didn't want to believe she was capable of sustained deception. But looking back, I think that was the moment she chose to become someone who could live with lying to you indefinitely. Jessica paused. Madison, I'm telling you this because I think you should know that Emma had multiple opportunities to choose differently. This wasn't just a mistake that spiraled out of control. She made conscious decisions, over and over, to continue deceiving you. But she also felt guilty about it. Yes, but she chose to manage the guilt rather than address its cause. That's not the same as being unable to help herself. After Jessica's call, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, trying to process everything I'd learned. Emma had felt guilty about her deception for years, but had chosen to continue it anyway. She'd had opportunities to come clean, but had decided that protecting herself was more important than honesty. Did that make her current apparent remorse less genuine? Or did it make her decision to finally accept full consequences more meaningful? Realize that I'd been looking for certainty in a situation that was inherently uncertain. I would never know with complete confidence whether Emma's transformation was real or performed. What I could know was what kind of justice would allow me to live with myself going forward. The question wasn't whether Emma deserved maximum punishment or minimum mercy. The question was what outcome would serve both justice and healing, not just for Emma, but for me. As I prepared for the sentencing hearing, I realized that the decision I was about to make would define not just Emma's future, but the kind of person I wanted to be in the aftermath of betrayal. Whether Emma was genuinely repentant or skillfully manipulative, I had to choose based on my own values and my own sense of what justice meant. The weight of that choice was about to become very real. The Cook County Criminal Courthouse was an imposing Art Deco building that had seen decades of human drama play out within its marble halls. As I walked through the metal detectors on the morning of Emma's sentencing hearing, I clutched the folded papers in my purse that contained my victim impact statement, the words that would help determine whether my sister spent 3 years or 7 years in prison. I'd rewritten that statement 17 times over the past week, each draft reflecting a different version of justice, a different balance between punishment and mercy. The final version, completed at 3 a.m. after another sleepless night, represented the hardest decision I'd ever made. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, institutional glow. Emma sat at the defendant's table with Mr. Walsh, wearing a navy blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the confident medical student I'd confronted at the graduation party weeks earlier. She turned when I entered, and our eyes met for just a moment. There was no attempt at manipulation in her gaze, no calculated appeal for sympathy. She looked tired, scared, and resigned to whatever fate awaited her. Judge Patricia Martinez was a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and the kind of serious demeanor that suggested she'd presided over countless family tragedies. She reviewed the case file while the courtroom filled with the few people who'd come to witness Emma's sentencing. Jason, Dr. Kim, Mrs. Cartwright, who'd driven in from the suburbs, and surprisingly, Kyle Brennan. The court calls the case of People versus Emma Claire Mitchell, Judge Martinez announced. Ms. Mitchell, you've entered a guilty plea to charges of grand theft, forgery, and fraud. Before sentencing, the court will hear victim impact statements and any final arguments from counsel. Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Kim stood first, her presentation crisp and professional. Your Honor, the defendant engaged in a systematic campaign of financial fraud against her own sister, forging signatures to steal over $70,000 while manipulating the victim into working multiple jobs to support the lifestyle that the stolen money made possible. She gestured toward a table covered with evidence. The sophistication of this deception, the forged documents, the fake financial distress, the manipulation of family loyalty, demonstrates calculated criminal behavior that deserves significant punishment. The state recommends a sentence of 5 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. 5 years. The number echoed in my mind as Mr. Walsh stood to present Emma's defense. Your Honor, while we don't dispute the seriousness of Ms. Mitchell's actions, we ask the court to consider several mitigating factors. Ms. Mitchell voluntarily confessed to her crimes, cooperated fully with law enforcement, and has taken immediate steps to address the psychological issues that contributed to her behavior. Walsh's voice was measured, professional. She's entered therapy, shown genuine remorse, and specifically requested that this court impose appropriate consequences rather than accepting a reduced plea agreement. This is not someone seeking to evade responsibility, but someone committed to making amends for her actions. Judge Martinez listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Walsh finished, she looked directly at me. Ms. Parker, you've submitted a victim impact statement. Would you like to read it to the court, or shall I review it privately? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, dreading and anticipating for weeks. I stood on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I unfolded the papers I'd rewritten so many times. I'd like to read it, Your Honor. Judge Martinez nodded. Please proceed. I cleared my throat and began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Your Honor, my name is Madison Parker, and Emma Mitchell is my sister. For the past 4 years, she systematically stole from me, lied to me, and manipulated me while I worked multiple jobs to support her medical education. The financial damage was significant, over $70,000 that represented my entire inheritance from our grandparents and much of my savings. I paused, looking at Emma, who was staring at the table in front of her. But the emotional damage was worse. Emma didn't just steal my money. She stole my trust, my sense of family, and my faith in my own judgment. She used my love for her as a weapon against me, knowing exactly which emotional buttons to push to keep me compliant and supportive while she lived in luxury at my expense. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of the court. Reporters typing. Emma had multiple opportunities to tell me the truth. Friends confronted her about the deception. She felt guilty about what she was doing. But each time she chose to continue lying because it was easier than facing consequences. I took a deep breath, reaching the part of the statement that I'd struggled with most. However, Your Honor, I also need to acknowledge something else. Emma is my sister. She's the person who held my hand at our parents' funeral, who used to call me when medical school felt overwhelming, who wrote me letters thanking me for my support, even while she was betraying that support. Emma looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I've spent weeks trying to figure out whether her current remorse is genuine or just another manipulation. I've talked to experts, friends, family members. I've analyzed every conversation, every gesture, every tear. I looked directly at Judge Martinez, but I realized that's the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of justice serves both accountability and healing? What sentence acknowledges the seriousness of Emma's crimes while still allowing for the possibility of redemption? I could feel the tension in the courtroom as everyone waited for my recommendation. Your Honor, I recommend that Emma Mitchell be sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with full restitution requirements. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible across the quiet courtroom. 4 years is long enough to ensure she faces real consequences for her actions, but not so long that it becomes purely punitive. The extended probation and restitution requirements will ensure she spends years making amends for what she took from me. I folded the papers, my hands steadier now. Emma destroyed the sister relationship we had, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to rebuild trust between us. But I don't want to destroy her entire life out of anger, even justified anger. I want justice, not revenge. I sat down, emotionally drained but relieved to have finally said everything I needed to say. Judge Martinez was quiet for several minutes, reviewing documents and making notes. Finally, she looked up at Emma. Ms. Mitchell, do you have anything to say before sentencing? Emma stood slowly, her voice barely audible when she began to speak. Your Honor, I want to thank my sister for her statement. Even after everything I did to her, she found a way to balance justice with mercy, which is more than I deserved. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. I have no excuse for what I did. I had opportunities to tell the truth, to ask for help, to find other ways to finance my education. Instead, I chose to steal from the person who loved me most, and I compounded that theft with years of manipulation and lies. She turned to look at me directly. Madison, I know my apology can't undo the damage I caused, and I know it will take years, maybe decades, for me to earn even the possibility of your forgiveness. But I want you to know that every day I'm in prison, I'll be thinking about how to become someone worthy of the love and sacrifice you showed me, even when I was busy betraying both. Emma faced the judge again. Your Honor, I accept full responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate. Judge Martinez studied Emma for a long moment before speaking. Ms. Mitchell, the court has rarely seen a case where the defendant rejected a favorable plea agreement to accept full responsibility for their crimes. While this doesn't excuse your actions, it does suggest genuine remorse and a commitment to accountability. She consulted her notes one final time. The court also notes the victim's thoughtful recommendation, which balances the need for punishment with recognition of the family relationship involved. Judge Martinez's voice became formal, final. Emma Claire Mitchell, you are hereby sentenced to 4 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to the victim in the amount of $95,000, plus court costs and fees. You will continue psychological counseling as directed by your probation officer. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Emma closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with what looked like relief rather than despair. 4 years was exactly what I'd recommended, long enough to be serious consequences, short enough to allow for rebuilding her life afterward. As the bailiff approached to take Emma into custody, she turned to me one last time. Madison, she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom, thank you for saving me from myself. I love you. I love you too, I replied, surprising myself with how easily the words came. Use this time well, Emma. The bailiff led Emma away, and she didn't look back. 3 months later, I received my first letter from Emma in prison. It was different from the letters she'd sent during medical school. No requests for money, no carefully crafted updates, designed to maintain my support, no manipulation disguised as gratitude. Instead, it was a simple, honest account of her daily routine, her therapy sessions with the prison psychologist, and her work in the prison library teaching other inmates. To read, she was earning 40 cents an hour, she wrote, and every penny went toward her restitution payments. I know it will take decades to pay you back, she wrote in her careful handwriting. But for the first time in years, I'm earning money honestly, and that feels like progress. She didn't ask for visits, didn't request money for commissary items, didn't hint that I should write back. She simply shared her experience and signed the letter. With love and genuine remorse, Emma. I did write back, though it took me weeks, to find the right words. I told her about my new job at a larger accounting firm, about the therapy I'd started to process the betrayal and manipulation I'd experienced, about the slow process of rebuilding my trust in my own judgment. I'm not ready to forgive you completely, I wrote, but I'm proud that you're using this time to become someone better. That gives me hope that someday we might find a way to be sisters again, even if it looks different than before. 2 years. Into Emma's sentence, she qualified for an early release program that would let her serve the final year in a halfway house while working at a nonprofit organization. She called me from prison to discuss it, our first phone conversation since her sentencing. Madison, I want to apply for the program, but only if you're comfortable with it. I know seeing me out in the world again might be difficult for you. Her voice was different, calmer, more grounded, without the calculated charm I'd grown so used to detecting. Where would you be working? I asked. A literacy center on the South Side, teaching adults to read and helping them with job applications, financial planning, basic life skills. It's the kind of work that feels like genuine service rather than just serving my time. I thought about it for several minutes while Emma waited patiently on the line. Emma, I think you should apply. Not because I'm ready to have you back in my life completely, but because it sounds like meaningful work that will help you continue growing. Thank you, she said simply. And Madison? The restitution payments. I've saved enough from my prison job to send you a check for $1,500. It's not much, but it's a start. After hanging up, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Emma was no longer asking for my protection or support. She was asking for my permission to take the next step in rebuilding her life while taking concrete action to make amends for her crimes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something like redemption, earned through years of genuine accountability rather than dramatic gestures or manipulative appeals. 6. Months later, I attended Emma's halfway house graduation ceremony. She'd completed her program successfully, secured full-time employment at the literacy center, and maintained perfect compliance with all the terms of her probation. When they called her name, she walked across the small stage with quiet dignity, accepting her certificate of completion without fanfare. Afterward, she approached me hesitantly. Madison, thank you for coming. It means everything to me. You've earned it, I said, and for the first time in years, I meant it completely. We didn't hug. We weren't ready for that. But we stood together in the community center where she'd completed her program. Two sisters who'd found a way through betrayal and consequence to something that might eventually become trust again. Emma still had 3 years of probation ahead of her and decades of restitution payments to make. But she was free, employed, and genuinely committed to making amends for what she'd done. It wasn't the ending either of us had imagined when this story began with her telling me I didn't belong at her graduation party. But it was an ending that honored both justice and the possibility of redemption, which, I'd learned, was sometimes the best you could hope for when family love collides with betrayal. As I drove home that evening, I realized that forgiveness isn't always about absolving someone of their crimes. Sometimes it's about creating space for them to earn their way back to being worthy of love, while protecting yourself from further harm. Emma had earned that chance. Whether she would make the most of it remained to be seen. But for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I believed she might. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.